For centuries, we've called it a dark age. But beneath the surface, the Anglo-Saxon world was a place of complex laws, surprising rights, and a rigid golden order. At the top stood the king, but society was a web of kinship and service. Every man and woman had a place, and every life had a price. This price was the weregild. It wasn't just a fine, it was a system of judicial biology designed to stop the cycle of blood feuds before they tore kingdoms apart. A noble then was worth 1,200 shillings, a common churl 200. Even the enslaved had a value, though paid to their masters as property damage. The law was an insurance policy. Lose a thumb? That's 20 shillings. A front tooth? 6. Even a torn fingernail had its price in the king's peace. But perhaps the most hidden fact of all was the power held by women. Unlike the eras that followed, an Anglo-Saxon woman was a person of substance and law. Upon marriage, she received the morgengifu, a gift from her husband that belonged to her alone. She could own land, sell it, and testify in court. She had the right to leave. If a woman chose to walk away from an abusive marriage, the law granted her half the household property and custody of her children. Justice was a community effort. Before the modern jury, there were oath helpers, men who swore to the truth of your word before the eyes of God and the king. When oaths failed, they turned to the ordeal, carrying hot iron or plunging an arm into boiling water, rituals where they believed God himself would reveal the truth. The outcome was in the healing. A clean wound meant innocence, a festering one meant guilt. It was a world where the physical and spiritual were one, and there were no police. If you witnessed a crime, you were legally bound to raise the hue and cry, shouting for the entire village to join the chase. If a village failed to catch the suspect, the entire community was fined. In the Anglo-Saxon world, your neighbor's business was very much your own. Even the smallest theft carried a weight. Bees were so vital for honey and mead that stealing a hive was a serious offense against the king's laws. This was the foundation of their world, a balance of duty, price, and unexpected freedom. But wait until you see how they treated the body and the soul. In a world without modern labs, the Anglo-Saxons were masters of the natural world. They were not just superstitious, they were effective, hidden scientists. Their knowledge was recorded in massive manuscripts like Bald's Leech Book. Within these pages lie recipes that continue to shock modern scientists today. They called their doctors leeches, not after the worm, but from the Old English word lace, meaning one who heals or enchants. They were part botanist, part surgeon, and part spiritual warrior. In 2015, researchers found that a 1,000-year-old eye salve recipe using garlic, onion, and bovine bile was more effective at killing the MRSA superbug than modern antibiotics. But their skills went beyond potions. Anglo-Saxon leeches performed surgeries so advanced we once thought they were impossible for the Dark Ages. They drilled into skulls to relieve pressure on the brain. Archaeological evidence shows that many patients didn't just survive, they lived for years after these procedures. They even practiced plastic surgery. The Leech Book describes how to repair a cleft lip by cutting the edges and sewing them together with fine silk thread. Medicine was also a spiritual battle. Sudden pains were blamed on elf shot, invisible arrows fired by malicious beings. To them, healing required both the physical herb and the spoken charm. In a world without clocks, they used prayers as timers. Singing the Paternoster 9 times ensured a herbal potion was steeped for exactly the right duration. Infectious diseases were seen as flying venom, a literal poison traveling on the wind. They fought it with the 9 herbs charm, invoking ancient gods and sacred plants. Their medicine was a dance between faith and observation. But what did they eat to stay healthy? And what happened when the crops failed? That's the story of the next chapter. When we think of Anglo-Saxon meals, we imagine massive joints of meat and endless feasting. But the reality, hidden in their bones, tells a very different story. Isotope analysis of thousands of skeletons reveals that for most of the year, everyone from the king to the ceorl was largely vegetarian. Meat was a rare luxury. Meat-heavy feasts were strategic political events. A king would travel to manors where peasants hosted massive barbecues of whole roasted oxen to secure loyalty. These were the campaigns of the age. A feast was more than a meal. It was a display of power and a bond of service written in grease and smoke. Their gardens were full of surprises. They cultivated white and purple carrots. The orange ones we know today didn't exist yet, along with nettles and wild herbs. Without sugar, honey was their most precious sweetener. The Anglo-Saxons were prolific beekeepers, and the theft of a hive was a serious crime. Mead was the drink of the elite, a fermented honey wine that brought wisdom. For everyone else, there was ale, safer to drink than water and full of needed calories. Their diet left a mark. Stone-ground flour was full of grit, wearing their teeth down to the gums by middle age, yet they remained almost entirely free of cavities. But life was fragile. A bad harvest meant famine, forcing them to occasionally eat horses or grind poisonous weed seeds into their bread just to survive. Survival was a year-round battle against the elements. It forged a people who were resilient, resourceful, and deeply connected to their land. Food sustained their bodies, but their society demanded they grow up fast. Next, we'll see what it was like to be a child in a world where you became an adult at 10. In our world, we protect the innocence of childhood for as long as possible. But for the Anglo-Saxons, childhood was a brief, intense sprint toward the responsibilities of a man. By the age of 10, a child was no longer a child in the eyes of the law. They were legal adults, capable of being punished for crimes and expected to contribute to the survival of the village. For most, education was practical, learned in the fields or the forge. But for those destined for the church or the court, life moved into the silent stone halls of the monasteries. Here they learned the arts of the mind. Reading, writing, and the complex grammar of Latin were the tools of the elite, taught through discipline and repetition. Paper was non-existent. Students practiced their calligraphy on tablets made of whalebone and filled with wax. Once a lesson was learned, the wax was smoothed over, and the classroom was ready for the next day. To keep young minds engaged, teachers used scripted colloquies, conversations full of colorful insults and medieval trash talk. It was a way to make a dead language feel alive and urgent. Education also happened through stories and riddles. The Anglo-Saxons loved mental gymnastics, using complex metaphors to describe everything from a shield to an onion, sharpening the wits of the next generation. The transition was abrupt. At 10, the play of childhood ended, replaced by the weight of the sayax and the solemn oaths of the tithing, the group of men legally responsible for your actions. They grew up in a world that was as magical as it was harsh. Next, we step beyond the physical world to see the spirits and monsters that shared their everyday lives. To the Anglo-Saxons, the world was not just wood and stone. It was a place where the physical and spiritual were constantly intersecting, a world they called Midgard. Midgard, the inspiration for Tolkien's Middle-earth, was the human realm, a fragile island of light surrounded by a vast, often hostile spiritual landscape. They believed they shared their fields and forests with invisible neighbors, malicious elves who shot arrows of disease, and ancient giants who built the stone ruins left behind by the Romans. They called these ruins the work of giants. To a people living in timber halls, these massive stone structures were proof of a legendary past that still haunted the present. The boundary between human and animal was thin. They told stories of shapeshifters and the free soul, a part of yourself that could leave the body during dreams to visit the ancestors. Everything in their world was alive. Trees, stones, and rivers had spirits. Even after they converted to Christianity, they still spoke to the Earth Mother to bless their fields and ensure a harvest. This was the Ekkerbot, a ritual where Christian prayers were blended with ancient earth magic. It was a society that kept one foot in the new faith and one in the ancient soil. They saw the soul as a traveler. Death was not just an end, but a departure, a final flight from Midgard to the halls of the gods or the quiet of the earth. This magical world would soon face its greatest challenge. Next, we witness the arrival of the Vikings and the Norman conquest, the moments that ended their world and began our own. For 6 centuries, the Anglo-Saxons built a kingdom. But a storm was gathering on the horizon, a Viking wave that wouldn't just raid but would stay to rule. In 865, the Great Heathen Army arrived. This wasn't a hit-and-run raid. It was a full-scale invasion that toppled 3 of the 4 great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. England was split in 2. To the east lay the Danelaw, where Viking laws and customs took root, creating a unique cultural hybrid that changed the face of the island forever. One man stood in the way, Alfred of Wessex. He fought the Vikings with steel and math, building a network of 33 fortified towns, or burhs, to protect his people. The merger was hidden in plain sight. Common words like sky, window, and even husband were Viking gifts to the English language, born from centuries of trade and intermarriage. The Saxon response was the select fyrd, veteran freemen required by law to provide their own weapons. They were a professional mobile wall of iron against the Viking axe. By 1066, this machine faced its final test. King Harold mustered his army at the Hoare Apple Tree, an ancient boundary marker, before the fateful clash with the Normans. For 9 hours, the shield wall held. It was one of the most sophisticated military formations of the age, failing only when the king himself was hacked down by a Norman hit squad. The kings died, but the people stayed. Today, the average person in England carries nearly 40% Anglo-Saxon DNA. Their story isn't just in the dirt, it's in us. From the Weregild to Mid-Dangard, their world was brilliant, complex, and resilient. Remember their story, for it is the foundation of our own. The kingdoms are gone, and the timber halls have turned to dust. But the Anglo-Saxon world never truly ended. It is hidden in plain sight, in the very code of our lives. Recent genomic studies have revealed a staggering truth. In parts of eastern England, as much as 76% of the ancestry derives from the original Anglo-Saxon migration. Even today, the average person in England is nearly 40% Anglo-Saxon by descent. They didn't just conquer, they integrated, becoming the biological foundation of the modern nation. Their map is our map. Over 90% of English place names have Anglo-Saxon origins. Suffixes like ton for farm and berry for fortified place act as a linguistic guide to their original settlements. Even the menu has a class map. We use Saxon words for the animals in the field, pig and cow, because the Saxons remained the farmers. But we use the Norman French terms, pork and beef, for the food served at the table. Our very days are a tribute to their gods. From Tuesday to Thursday, we speak the names of their pantheon every week, a permanent echo of their spiritual world in our modern time. Their legacy is not just in the past, it's the bedrock of our democracy, our language, and our identity. Their story is the story of the birth of England. The Dark Ages were never truly dark. They were a time of brilliant order, profound faith, and resilient spirit. Remember them, for we are their legacy. Thank you for joining this journey.